Good afternoon, teachers. Today we're going to talk about the introduction to the aggregate supply aggregate demand model. Much like with the microeconomic supply and demand model, I tend to do this in a different order than the book does. I like to introduce the model as a whole first, and then introduce determinants individually. So this entire section of aggregate supply aggregate demand model, this basically takes up a 48-minute class period for me, so half of one of your 90-minute class periods. So let's go over kind of the basics of what the model is, what it shows, and then in future videos, we'll go over the determinants and actually how to manipulate that model, and we'll figure out exactly what happens when different determinants come into play. So at its core, the aggregate supply aggregate demand model basically is the macroeconomics version of simple supply and demand. So essentially what we're doing is we're taking the supply and demand graphs of all the different markets for all the products across the entire macroeconomy, and we're smushing them together into one unified graph. So what this is basically like is instead of showing you the price and the quantity of, say, peanut butter or bicycles, this is representing all of the products across the entire macroeconomy. So this is an entire economy scale as opposed to an individual product or an individual market. In so doing, as we create the aggregate supply aggregate demand model, the y-axis is no longer going to track the price of any individual product, but is going to track the price of products across the entire macroeconomy, something that we call the aggregate price level. If you remember from last unit how to calculate price index, the aggregate price level is represented here in terms of price index. It's relatively rare the AP exam ever actually makes you put a number on this axis, but just in case it does, the unit that we're using here is price index, and the kids should know how to calculate that from the last unit where we did economic indicators. The x-axis of this graph no longer has quantity on it, but now represents the macro version of quantity, which is known as real output, which is measured as a function of real GDP. So this is going to be measured in terms of dollars here. So what the aggregate supply aggregate demand model does is it basically attempts to show you the relationship between the aggregate price level and the overall level of productivity. So when I introduce this model, I always start by introducing the kids to the aggregate demand curve, as this is by far the most straightforward of the curves and the thing that they're most familiar with, so it's something that they're going to have less difficulty with. So what they need to know is that the aggregate demand curve is downward sloping, showing an inverse relationship between the aggregate price level and the level of our GDP that's going to be demanded. Although it looks exactly like the microeconomic demand curve, it's not downward sloping for the same reason. So this is where you'll need to introduce the kids to the wealth effect and the interest rate effect, which explain why the aggregate demand curve shows an inverse relationship between price level and our GDP. With that said, the aggregate demand curve is essentially a function of the level of consumer demand for products, the level of business demand for products, the level of government demand for products, and the level of the pressure on the exports. So at the end of the day, the aggregate demand curve is basically the same components as the components of GDP. So aggregate demand is equal to consumer spending plus investment spending plus government spending plus net exports. Keeping in mind that for a developed country like the United States, the number for net exports is very often going to be a negative number as we consume more than we produce. So at the end of the day, the things that cause aggregate demand to change are the exact same things that cause GDP to change. They have effectively the same major components. The more confusing portion of this model has to do with the fact that there are two aggregate supply curves. So you'll see here we have the short-run aggregate supply curve and the long-run aggregate supply curve. The short-run aggregate supply curve is showing a positive relationship between the aggregate price level and the level of real output, whereas the long-run aggregate supply curve is showing no relationship at all. And we'll need to discuss why that is and what the short run versus the long run are in macro. So the number one mistake that I think students make is that they presume that the short run means that it's something that happens relatively soon, and the long run is something that happens far, far away. This is not necessarily the case at all. So short run and long run are not descriptions of a measurement of time. It's not like the long run is a couple of years away and the short run is next week. Short run and long run in macroeconomics, rather, represent what is happening to the level of nominal wages in our economy. So they're not telling you how far away something is, but they're telling you what wages are doing. And knowing what wages are doing in the macroeconomy is going to help us to understand what producers are doing, as the level of productivity tends to be sensitive to changes in nominal wages. So the short-run aggregate supply curve represents a period of time where wages are sticky. Nominal wages are sticky in this case. And so what that means is your nominal wages stay the same, sometimes for years, while the aggregate price level rises. So over time, your buying power, what we call your real wages, starts to drop in the short run, provided that we're experiencing inflation. The minimum wage is a classic example of this. So the minimum wage is currently $7.25, but it's been $7.25 for many, many years. And what $7.25 buys you today is substantially less than what $7.25 bought you when the minimum wage was moved to $7.25 several years ago. So as the price level increases due to inflation, in the short run, wages aren't keeping up with inflation, which means that over time, your actual buying power, your real wages actually start to fall, which is really, really bad for the workers, but is actually beneficial to producers. Producers, remember, would much rather pay you lower wages rather than higher wages. So if I'm a producer here, I'm able to squeeze extra productivity out of my workers per each dollar that I pay them by continuing to pay them the same level of nominal wages, while I benefit by charging my customers more for the products that we produce. This helps to explain why the short-run aggregate supply curve shows a positive relationship between price level and real output, supplied in this case. So because higher prices are good for producers when wages are sticky, at higher price levels, producers actually ramp up production because they're earning higher profits due to the fact that they are not increasing nominal wages to coincide with their increase in prices. So long story short, producers are able to squeeze a little bit of extra productivity out of their workers by paying them the same wages, even as they charge the customer more, and this results in them producing more, which helps to explain why we have higher levels of real output supplied at higher price levels. Now, this is not going to be the case on the long-run aggregate supply curve. The long run in economics refers to a period of time where wages become flexible. So flexible wages are the opposite of sticky wages in this case. And these flexible wages will eventually catch up with inflation. So although workers will remain with sticky wages for a long time, they will eventually notice that their buying power is dropping. And when they finally notice, they're going to demand higher wages. They're going to renegotiate contracts at higher levels of compensation. And when they finally get those higher wages, when their nominal wages catch up with inflation, we shift from the short run to the long run. You'll notice in the long run, there is no relationship between changes in the aggregate price level and changes in real output. The reason for this being that if prices go up by 5%, but wages go up by 5%, it's basically the same to the producer. So you never get that increase in production that comes from lower real wages the way that you do in the short-run aggregate supply curve. So long-run aggregate supply is basically potential productivity in the economy. If wages were perfectly flexible and they always kept up with inflation, this is going to tell you what the level of productivity is going to be, and there is no increase in productivity that coincides with higher price levels